I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. The meetings on Ukraine that our Western colleagues requested follow the same fairly primitive template. Russia is accused of strikes on Ukrainian cities, and they try, without evidence, to assert that the targets of the attacks were allegedly civilian objects, ignoring the fact that during our strikes, civilian casualties are caused exclusively by falling shrapnel from missiles and drones that are shot down, or directly by Ukrainian air defense missiles that have gone off course. And the reason for that is also well known. The deployment by Ukraine of missile defenses in residential developments in violation of the basic norms of IHL, and yet targeted Ukrainian attacks involving missiles and drones on civilian objects on the territory of Russia are deliberately ignored. This is the ham-fisted formula that our Western colleagues, and again, they seem to be filling up the room today like sardines, they could long ago have trained an AI to follow this scheme when writing their generic statements, given how inhuman and detached from reality it is. And perhaps they're already doing that, since there's nothing new that goes beyond this template that we've heard today. My response to these accusations today is probably also not going to contain anything new. Yes, we did indeed, in the night between the 27th and the 28th of August, in pursuit of the aim of demilitarizing Ukraine, strike objects that relate to the military-industrial complex of that country. As was announced today by the Ministry of Defense of Russia, 62% of the key military enterprises of the military-industrial complex of Ukraine have been damaged. The group missile and air strike targeted in particular military airfields, Air Force arms depots, hangars, airport aprons, and other transport and energy nodes in a number of Ukrainian oblasts. In Kiev and Kiev Oblast, the main targets were companies of the military-industrial complex, including the factories Artyom, Kievsky Radiozavod, Spetsoboronmash, Slavutich, and Ukrspets Systems. They were directly involved in the development and production of various forms of UAVs, and they have capacity for the repair and production of radar stations, fire control systems, and UAF communications equipment, as well as UAF assembly lines and warehouses. At the same time, the Kiev regime, as in the past, shamelessly and criminally used the tactic of a human shield by putting these enterprises of the defense complex, air defenses and electronic warfare, near residential developments and densely populated areas of cities. And so it's no surprise that once again, Ukrainian air defense missiles hit residential districts. And that was the reason for damage being caused to the buildings of the UK and EU missions, and also the death of civilians in partially destroyed residential buildings. However, these victims were not only not forcing the criminal regime to, at long last, remove air defenses from and military enterprises from residential districts, but are actually being used by them as a tool for political manipulation. Every such tragedy is intentionally whipped up to blame the deaths of Ukrainian civilians on Russia, to appeal to Western sponsors and international donors, to demand the introduction of new sanctions, and to angle for new arms deliveries. And that happened today as well. Before our eyes, with the complicity of Western members of the Security Council, the lives of the civilians of Ukraine have been turned into a bargaining chip, and human suffering is becoming a way to achieve mercenary foreign policy goals. In light of the irremediable hypocrisy of our Western colleagues and their reluctance to expose the true reason for people dying, Ukrainian citizens have long ago figured out what's going on. They quickly understood that the danger for them was coming from the Ukrainian air defense systems and not Russian strikes. You don't believe me? Well, just read Ukrainian social networks. There, people have for a long time been warning one another about the deployment of air defense and military enterprises near their homes, and making fun of you, Western colleagues, and your awkward attempts to cover for the criminal Kiev regime. Mr. President, and there's another thing which is transforming today's meeting into a theater of the absurd. While emphasizing the victims and destruction in Ukrainian cities, The Western initiators of today's meeting are, as usual, deliberately ignoring the UAF's premeditated hunting of civilians, including women, children, and older persons on the territory of Russia. Ukrainian Nazis are intentionally using strike drones against apartment buildings and private residencies, civilian transport, agricultural machinery involved in collecting the harvest, and commercial and social facilities. Each day, Russian regions have tens and hundreds of drones launched against them. In the week from 18 to 24 August alone, the shelling of Ukrainian Nazis caused 140 civilian casualties. 120 people were wounded, including 8 minors, and 19 people died, including 1 child. Our Western colleagues aren't interested in those victims. They are part of their strategy to do harm to Russia at the hands of Ukraine, for the sake of which their anti-Russia project in the past was created by them. Moreover, they intentionally overlook the fact that our combined strike on objects of the military-industrial complex of Ukraine came in response to what has been going on for the last 2 weeks after the Alaska summit, that is to say, attacks on oil refineries in Russia. It's clear that these strikes have no strategic military significance because they don't impact the situation on the contact line. Their true aim is an attempt to damage civilian energy infrastructure and to interrupt fuel supplies. Moreover, behind these actions is the calculation of provoking retaliatory measures from Russia to then misrepresent them as disproportionate and then accuse Moscow of sabotaging any attempts at peace talks. In this context, the strikes on the Druzhba oil pipeline are telling. It is one of the key routes for the delivery of oil to Europe. The most recent act of sabotage on the 22nd of August was so serious that it knocked out the pipeline for several days. In this case, this is a provocation designed to harm the economic interests of EU countries and infrastructure that ensures the energy stability of the region. Under pressure from Hungary and Slovakia, even the European Commission was forced to react to this. In other words, they are today playing up the consequences of Russia's retaliatory actions and intentionally not mentioning the fact of what provoked these strikes. It's a clumsy and hypocritical tactic that shows the selective blindness and double standards of our Western colleagues. Mr. President, these same glaring double standards are clearly on display when the Western accomplices of the Kiev regime continue to ignore what, even by the standards of the Maidan, are skyrocketing human rights violations by the Zelensky regime. We're talking about the mass trampling of fundamental human rights and freedoms, including those of the Russian-speaking population, the hateful harassment of dissenters, attempts to outlaw the canonical Orthodox Church. Even by the most modest calculations, around 7,000 Ukrainians, without reason, exclusively on political grounds, have been deprived of their freedom. And this also applies to clergy from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and also journalists and ordinary citizens who express an opinion that is not in line with the position of the regime. Recently, we together received a letter from a former deputy of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, who is now accused of high treason. His name is Alexander Dublinsky. The facts that he touches upon, including the death from torture in the dungeons of the Kiev regime of the American journalist Consuelo Lira, were confirmed by international human rights organizations and referred to in the report of the U.S. State Department on human rights in Ukraine for 2024. Just the other day, Security Council members received another letter, this time from the journalist Diana Panchenko. She asked the UN Secretary General to take measures to protect political prisoners. She refers also to reports from the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which notes systematic cases of arbitrary detention without official charges, the use of torture, and denial of access to justice under the Kiev regime. Attached to the letter is a list of more than 550 victims of political persecution in Ukraine. Even a brief analysis of the content of these letters allows us to draw a clear conclusion. The Zelensky regime has created a machine of repression that is based on violating fundamental human rights and freedoms. The state security bodies, obedient courts, and the security and defense agencies are being used to intimidate society and prevent dissent. How much longer will Security Council members ignore these cries for help and make out as though nothing of the sort is happening in Ukraine? And how much longer will the Western sponsors of the Kiev regime ignore the glaring evidence of rampant corruption among the elite of the Zelensky regime? At the beginning of the week, several Western media outlets reported that a former investigator of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine that had fled to Europe managed to bring with him several thousand pages of internal documents that exposed corruption schemes in the highest echelons of the Ukrainian authorities. Yelena K., whose surname is not provided, led a task force tracing offshore assets. The selectively published purchase and sale agreements and information from bank transfers indicates that Zelensky and those close to him used an extensive network of shell companies to launder illegal income and subsequently to purchase elite real estate abroad. And we're talking about an amount of more than $1.2 billion. And hundreds of properties, including in Spain, the UK, France, and Italy. I'm confident that this is just the tip of the iceberg, but that too is something that in the West they try to turn a blind eye to. Do you really not understand that by keeping afloat such rotten, corrupt, and misanthropic regimes, you are undermining what is left of your reputation in the world? Mr. President, if our Western colleagues were able to speak the truth, they would long since have acknowledged that for many years the West had been creating in Ukraine direct threats to the security of the Russian Federation and essentially indulged the actions of the Kiev regime to exterminate on Ukrainian territory everything Russian and the Russian-speaking population, in gross violation of the UN Charter, which requires upholding human rights, including linguistic and religious rights, as well as numerous international conventions, as well as the Constitution of Ukraine itself. This admission would be an excellent starting point for a long-term and sustainable settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. That's not happened yet, but there is some optimism coming from the fact that some of our partners, first and foremost the United States, are more and more understanding the need to address the root causes of the conflict, without which it won't be possible to resolve it. More and more understanding the need to address the root causes of the conflict, without which it won't be possible to resolve it. These sorts of trends that in particular emerged during the recent Russo-American summit in Alaska are keeping the Zelensky regime up at night, as well as its European sponsors. And so that is why they're doing everything they can to try to outmaneuver the positive understandings achieved in Alaska, or at least to distort them. This is most evident now when it comes to the issues of security. In that regard, I would like to declare to be unacceptable any new attempts to resolve collective security issues in circumvention of Russia without taking into account our interests and concerns. These attempts were what provoked the crisis situation in the Euro-Atlantic area, and the solution to that is not yet in sight. We have repeatedly explained our position of principle on this, a cornerstone of which is mutual respect and equality. We oppose any impingement on the sovereignty and independence of other states, and we will not allow such attempts when it comes to Russia. Our legitimate interests in the security sphere will be upheld hard and fast. In the form of security guarantees, the collective West is promoting one-sided, essentially neo-colonial initiatives to deter Russia. This relates to the clearly unfeasible European plans for the further militarization of Ukraine, the building up of the military presence of NATO countries in the Black Sea region, including airspace patrols. And they are also shamelessly proposing to limit the number of guarantor countries to the key states of NATO. Colleagues, the provision of security guarantees is not a condition, but rather the result of a peace settlement after the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine have been removed. The security guarantees in the form that they are being voiced by our former European partners would only facilitate a further degradation of strategic stability at the regional and global levels. In this regard, it would be appropriate to recall the initiative of the Ukrainian side itself, which was proposed by Ukraine in April 2022 in Istanbul. The Ukrainian negotiating team at the time outlined the main principles of an agreement on concluding the hostilities and ensuring a sustainable settlement. That included Ukraine's abandonment of entry into NATO or any other
нейтрального и безъядерного статуса. В этом контексте украинская сторона предложила.
The Ukrainian side proposed, and our delegation agreed to develop security guarantees, the parties to which would be all of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, as well as specific states that may have an interest in joining this group of security guarantors. It is evident that Kiev's proposal presupposed that those guarantees would be equal and the security of all interested parties, including Ukraine's neighbours, would be ensured on an equal, indivisible basis. We supported that option. The document was initialed and we were prepared to sign an official treaty. We understand it now as well and we are prepared to consider it. Unlike the various other schemes being discussed that essentially boil down to the territory that is still under Ukrainian control being buttressed by NATO countries, even going as far as the introduction of military contingents there. For Russia, that is absolutely unacceptable because it could lead to an uncontrolled escalation of the conflict with unpredictable consequences. Those that advance such ideas are not interested in resolving the crisis, rather they want to perpetuate it, possibly through a temporary freeze. That is not at all what we were talking about in Alaska. We also note many attempts to distort the idea of holding a Russo-Ukrainian summit and assertions that Russia is allegedly not prepared to do so. Quite the opposite. We have repeatedly said that we can consider this scenario, but provided that there is thorough prior preparation for such a meeting and the substantive content of it. Otherwise, it would simply not have any meaning. We do stand ready to work in any formats with the understanding that that should be in good faith and honest. A possible Russo-Ukrainian high-level meeting could draw up mutual agreements that are based on well-understood steps and measures following the Alaska summit. However, what can we talk about really if Zelensky is publicly saying that he does not, for example, want to discuss the question of territory, in so doing throwing down the gauntlet to President Donald Trump, who openly said that that should be the subject of negotiations? The head of the Kiev regime has also clearly stated that no one can ban Ukraine from joining NATO, which also runs counter to what was said by President Trump. Zelensky also is not intending to repeal the laws that essentially ban the Russian language, destroy Russian culture, education, Russian language media, and the canonical UOC. If the expired Ukrainian president is not prepared for these discussions and in general does not want to make any compromises, which he has repeatedly highlighted over the past 10 days, then it's not entirely clear why he is insisting on a meeting with Russian President Putin. Mr. President, to achieve mutually acceptable solutions that would guarantee a non-repetition of the conflict, diplomatic efforts must be intensified. I would remind you that during the third round of the renewed Istanbul negotiating track on the 23rd of July, we proposed that the Ukrainian side consider the creation of 3 working groups on political, humanitarian and military issues. We believe that this would allow us to more specifically consider the agenda items, and that could be useful in terms of bringing our positions closer together and achieving a settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. More than a month has gone by since then, but we have still not got a response from Ukraine. We believe that this matter and the course of the negotiations in Istanbul in general to be something of a litmus test for what Kiev is really interested in. Is it diplomatic work or simply PR and the sabotage of constructive mediation efforts? Thank you for your attention.
Agradezco a la delegación